All right, Rabosai, good morning. All right, Rabosai, good morning. Chabran Zoom, you hear me okay? All right, excellent. All right, let us begin. So we are continuing in Meretz Hashem in Tzidkas Hatzaddik, Os Zayin. Okay. In Tzidkas Hazayin, Os Chav Zayin. So we are focusing on what we started yesterday on page Samich Gimel, and we're focusing on the Rebbe's beautiful idea of this concept of davening over the galus, specifically davening for the end of the galus, both in the beginning of the night and the beginning of the day. So Hatzaddik really highlighted two critical points. Number one, that sometimes the galus itself is most acutely felt at times of change. Stafka, when things change, that we would get into a routine and things kind of continue on as normal. We don't necessarily feel galus in its full extent. But then when something changes and we're shaken out of our normal routine, then suddenly we begin to feel the effects of the fact that we live a little bit of a disjointed life as a result of being in exile, as a result of persecution, as a result of diaspora. But then Hatzaddik really highlighted a second point, which is what we ended off yesterday's shir on, and we're going to focus on in today's shir, is this notion of when we daven over the galus, what is it exactly that we are davening for? And I think for many of us, this represents an ongoing challenge in our Yiddishkeit. We know that we are supposed to mourn over the Beis HaMikdash. We know that we are supposed to mourn over the fact that we are in exile. Yet again, especially in our day and age, it's very difficult ultimately to connect with that reality. As Baruch Hashem, we are acutely aware that we are not in Eretz Yisrael, and we are acutely aware that we are in diaspora. But at the end of the day, the tsar of galus, something that for many of us is difficult to connect to. And the tsar of the Shechina, we'll get to the tsar of Shechina in a little bit. So Tzaddik highlighted this incredible idea. And let's actually pick up with it. In Be'uria Chasidus on page Samech Gimel, so it's the left-hand paragraph, right in the bracket. So it's second line in the left-hand paragraph. Utfila zu koleles es hakol. Shari shibud malchius hamafriya la'adam ba'avodas Hashem mitzad umos ha'olam u'sa'ar shebe'isa shua yitzahara shebalev shnei matzirim elu shkulim u'makbilim zelozeh. So Hatzaddik over here links the notion of shibud malchius, persecution, with sa'ar shebe'isa, the yeast that is in the dough. So of course, the yeast in the dough, remember, is a metaphor for the Yetzer Hara. Right? The Yetzer Hara is just like the yeast in the dough causes the dough to rise. So the yeast, the Yetzer Hara in man, causes man to rise up and to commit acts against Hashem and against himself. So Hatzaddik says these two things are connected. What is it that fuels the Yetzer Hara? What is it that fuels the Sa'ar Shebe'isa? Hatzaddik says it's galus. It's galus. You see, this is an incredible idea. That Hatzaddik says that what does galus do? Galus creates discomfort. Galus creates discomfort. So ultimately, again, and what happens? So it creates physical discomfort. At times, it creates spiritual discomfort. So what happens when man is in a state of discomfort? The most natural reaction is you seek something to soothe your discomfort. So in the ideal sense, when a person is in discomfort, they should seek out ruchnius. They should seek out spirituality to soothe that discomfort. But the reality is that that more often than not, we seek out other things to soothe our discomfort. And those other things sometimes are sinful in nature. So Tzaddik says something amazing, that this concept of galus and the Yetzer Hara are two concepts, excuse me, that in reality are intertwined. In reality are intertwined. And again, the more acute the galus, the more acute the Yetzer Hara. He says, Utluyim zebazeh, michivan sha'al yidei hara, sheish be'umos olam, nimshach kam hara elevavos Yisrael. He says, the more acute the suffering is in galus, the more intense the Yetzer Hara becomes. Now, both say, so the truth is, there's two dimensions to this. So dimension number one is just as we mentioned. So dimension number one is that Galus creates discomfort. When man is in discomfort, he seeks to soothe that discomfort. Often we seek to soothe that discomfort in inappropriate ways. So there is this direct correlation. And I will say it's an incredible, I think that there's an incredible psychological perspective on this also. That Hatzaddik is getting into a little bit in terms of the psychology of sin. That sometimes the reason we sin is that sin in and of itself is an escape. You see this a lot in the world of addictions. That many times, when people fall into the clutches of addiction, they're trying to escape something. Whether it's chas v'shalom, trauma, abuse, different things, they're seeking to soothe something. You see this, Rahman al-Islam, so much when dealing with teens at risk, that when you see beautiful children who engage in destructive behaviors, so the shayla is like, what is it? So of course, sometimes, again, we know that addiction is an illness. So illnesses sometimes are just that, illnesses, but other times, lemaisa, you have people who are so traumatized and people who are so scarred and people who are so hurt, and all they're looking to do is soothe their pain. So on what, and we'll say, where Hatzaddik says is, sometimes we do that with sin, which is an incredible idea. You know, we often assume that the reason people sin, why do I commit averos? I commit averos because I'm a bal taiva, right? I have desires, and I'm seeking to satisfy those desires. Now, that's certainly true. But on a deeper level, Hatzaddik says that sometimes I'm in pain about something, and instead of dealing with my pain in a healthy, productive way, I just seek to mask it. And I just seek somehow to soothe it and to ease it. And sin is that balm, right? Sin is that, what I perceive to be that antidote. Sin is that pleasure that will mask the pain. So where does that pain come from? So Hatzaddik says, well, existential pain comes from galus. So the more intense the galus, the more intense the Yitzhar, the more intense the sin, which is just an incredibly different way to look at chait. Because, and I will say, I think it's an incredibly instructive exercise that, you know, all of us struggle with averas. I was going to say, all of us struggle with an avera. If you just struggle with one avera, you are a lucky person. But many of us struggle with multiple averas. And it's fascinating to kind of do this exercise and to ask myself, why do I engage in this avera? What is it? What is it? So again, sometimes it's just taiva, sometimes it's just desire. But I think if we look deep inside of ourselves, sometimes when we struggle with a particular avera, it's often because it's my drug, right? It's my drug, it's my alcohol, it's my addiction. It's the thing that sometimes I indulge in because I'm in pain about something. And instead of dealing with the pain in a direct fashion, instead of dealing with the pain directly, I mask it with the pleasure of some type of illicit or illegal activity. But then Hatzaddik introduces something else, which is galus also has an impact in that it eats away at our relationship with Hashem. Right? What galus does is it puts a strain on my relationship with God. And in that moment where there's a strain in my relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam, so by definition, as my relationship with Hashem becomes weaker, the ability to sin becomes easier. So this is also, you know, the Piaseczna, Rav Kalmas Kalman Shapira, writes about this in his Eish Kodesh. This notion that what he lamented most, at least in the beginning of the war, was this notion that because the Nazis, Yimach Shemam V'Zichram, had closed the shuls, closed the Batei Medrash, so therefore the relationship with Hashem became more strained and became more difficult. And when that happens, by definition, sin becomes easier. Therefore, says Rab Tzaddik, when we mourn over galus, and I'm very excited about this because I can say that for the first time in my life, I see an approach regarding mourning for galus that is relatable, fully relatable. So Reb Tzaddik says, what is it when we say that you have to mourn for the gullus? And Reb Tzaddik is saying, you have to mourn for the gullus in the morning, you have to mourn for the gullus in the evening. So what does that mean? So Reb Tzaddik says what it means is, mourn for the gullus because appreciate what the gullus has done to me. And understand the impact it really does have on me every single day. I will say, if we're honest, if somebody asks you, does not having the Beis HaMikdash have an impact on you today? So of course, what are you going to answer? Of course it does. Now, why are you answering that? Of course it does. Because if you say no, you don't look from. So you have to say, of course it has an impact, 100%. I feel it every day. You don't feel it. I don't feel it, that there's no Beis HaMikdash. And that's not a chisaron in us. I don't know what a Beis HaMikdash is. So it's hard for me to say that the absence of the Beis HaMikdash so fundamentally impacts me. But this I understand. The absence of the Beis HaMikdash and Galus does have an impact on me. Why? Because at the end of the day, the greater the intensity of Galus and persecution throughout the ages, the greater my existential pain becomes. The greater my existential pain becomes, the more I need to soothe that pain. I should soothe it with God. I should soothe it with Torah. But the reality is, very often, I soothe it with all the wrong things. So the greater the intensity of Galus, the greater the yeast in the dough, the greater the Yetzer Hara. Furthermore, the greater the intensity of Galus, the greater the pain, the more I'm pushed away from Hashem. And the more I'm pushed away from Hashem, the greater the other forces inside of me become. Therefore, says Reb Tzaddik, when we daven for the end of the Galus, we're davening, yes, for the end of the Tzara of the Shechina, we're davening for the restoration of the Beis HaMikdash, but most of all, I'm davening for the fact that I should become a stronger spiritual individual. Now, we'll stop over here. We'll continue Yetzer Hashem more with this concept tomorrow. Yeah.